What are you talking about? Mark's tone became even more frightening. His voice was no longer playful but serious and threatening. Don't act like you don't know, he said, his voice dripping with malice. You know exactly what I am talking about. Panic surged through Sarah's body. She pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to think of a way out, but her mind was blank. In a peaceful community in Anambra, there lived a widow named Mrs. John and her only daughter, Sarah. Their house was small, with worn-out walls and a roof that had seen better days, but it was home to them. The sun always shone brightly in the village, and the evenings were calm with the sound of birds and distant chatter from neighbors. The village, though simple, was full of kind people who knew each other very well. But life had not been kind to Mrs. John and Sarah since the passing of Mr. John. It had just been the two of them struggling to make ends meet. Sarah was a bright girl in her final year of the secondary school. She was preparing to write her senior WAEC exams, a very important exam that would allow her to go to the university. Sarah dreamed of becoming a doctor one day, but her dreams were threatened by the same thing that had always troubled their family: money. There just wasn't enough. One evening, as the sun set, Sarah sat quietly on the small wooden porch of their house. She looked out at the dusty path leading to their front door. Her mind was full of thoughts, memories of her late father, the struggle her mother had faced every day, and the exams that were fast approaching. Sarah remembered little about her father, except for brief moments when he would lift her high into the air, making her laugh. Those memories, however, felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Now, it was just her and her mother. Inside the house, Mrs. John was in the kitchen, preparing their simple dinner of rice and beans. She stirred the pot carefully, her thoughts not on the food but on how they were going to pay for Sarah's exam fees. Mrs. John had taken up all sorts of jobs, cleaning, washing and selling fruits in the market. Yet, it was never enough. Life was hard, and each day brought new memories. But Mrs. John never showed her pain to Sarah. She always tried to stay strong for her daughter. As Sarah entered the kitchen, she could smell the rice and beans. Normally, the smell of food would make her feel better. But today, the worry was too heavy on her mind. "Mama," Sarah said softly, trying to get her mother's attention, "we need to talk about the examination fees." Mrs. John stopped stirring the pot but didn't turn around. She already knew what Sarah wanted to talk about. "I know, my dear," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it too." Sarah stepped closer, her voice filled with urgency. "Mama, this is my last year. If I don't write these examinations, I won't be able to get into the university. We can't give up now." Mrs. John finally turned to face her daughter. Her eyes were full of love, but also sadness. "I know how important this is to you, Sarah," she said, her voice gentle. "But things have been so hard lately. I've tried to save, but it's not just enough." Tears began to well up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe I could get a job after school, or we could ask someone for help." Mrs. John shook her head. "I don't want you to worry about money, Sarah. You should focus on your studies." "But what other choice do we have, Mommy?" Sarah's voice was full of frustration. Mrs. John sighed, the weight of their troubles heavy on her shoulders. "I don't know, Sarah. I really don't know." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound coming from the bubbling pot on the stove. Sarah felt helpless. but she knew her mother had done everything she could. Despite their struggles, they had always had each other, and that was something no amount of money could change. "We will find a way," Mrs. Jones said finally, though her voice held a trace of doubt. "We have to believe that something will work out." Sarah nodded, trying to take comfort in her mother's words, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. A week passed, and things didn't get better. Then one evening, Mrs. John broke the news that Sarah had been dreading. "Sarah," she said gently as they sat together in their small living room, "you won't be writing the examination this year. We just don't have enough money for the fees." Sarah's heart sank. "But Mom, I've been working so hard. I can't wait another year," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Mrs. John looked at her with pain in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart, but we have no other choice. We will save up, and you can write the exams next year." Before Sarah could say more, there was a knock on the door. It was Auntie Lydia, Mrs. John's older sister. Auntie Lydia was the kind of person who always showed up at unexpected times, usually with a piece of advice or a solution to a problem. Mrs. John welcomed her in, and later that night, she told Auntie Lydia everything that had been troubling her. The next morning, Auntie Lydia woke Sarah early. She sat her niece down and looked her straight in her eyes. "I heard what's going on," Auntie Lydia said, her voice full of determination, "and I'm here to help." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Help? How?" "I'll pay for your exam fees," Auntie Lydia said firmly, "but there is one condition. You will come and live with me until you finish your exams. I want to make sure you are well taken care of and that you focus on your studies." Sarah hesitated. She looked at her mother, unsure of what to say. Mrs. John nodded. "It's a good opportunity, Sarah. Your aunt will make sure you have everything you need." After a moment, Sarah agreed. "Okay, Auntie Lydia, I'll go with you." The next day, Sarah packed her things and left with Auntie Lydia. As they arrived at Auntie Lydia's house, Sarah noticed a young man standing by the door. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an odd smile on his face. His eyes followed Sarah as she walked, making her feel uneasy. "Is that your husband?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. Auntie Lydia laughed softly. "No, dear, that's Mike, a friend's son. He's staying with us for a while." But something about the way Mark stared at her made Sarah feel uncomfortable. As she walked past him, he smiled in a way that made her shiver. And so, Sarah began to stay at her auntie's house, where things were not as simple as they seemed. Sarah had settled into her new life, but it was very different from what she had known before. Auntie Lydia's home was much larger and nicer than the small house she shared with her mother. The house had big windows that let in lots of sunlight, and there was a lovely garden filled with flowers and trees that Sarah liked to look at. Auntie Lydia had promised Sarah a room of her own, and she kept that promise. Sarah's room was cozy and neat. It had a soft bed, a small desk where she could study, and a window that faced the garden. The room was beautiful, but it was right next to Mark's room. That made Sarah feel uneasy. Mark was the young man Sarah had met when she first arrived. He was staying with Auntie Lydia and her husband, Mr. Thomas, for reasons that Sarah didn't fully understand. When she asked about him, Auntie Lydia would say he was like family, and his mother was a close friend. However, Sarah didn't feel comfortable around him. He didn't do anything wrong, but he often stared at her in a way that made her feel strange, like she was being watched when she wasn't looking. Mr. Thomas, Auntie Lydia's husband, wasn't home very often. He traveled a lot for business, so it was mostly just Sarah, Auntie Lydia, and Mark in the house. Sometimes, Mr. Thomas would come home for a few days, but he always left again quickly. and Lydia explained that his job required him to travel and he was used to being away for a long period. She seemed fine with it, saying that they had been married for many years and she was used to his schedule. As for Mark, he was always there. He was polite enough, greeting Sarah with a smile or a nod whenever they crossed paths in the house. But there was something about him that made her uncomfortable. Every time she saw him, he seemed to be watching her. His stares lasted a little too long, and it made her feel nervous. She didn't know what to do about it, so she tried to ignore him and focus on her studies. One evening, Sarah was arranging her school books on her desk, preparing to study for her exams. She glanced towards the door and froze. Mark was standing in the doorway, not saying a word, just watching her. Sarah's heart raced, but she pretended not to notice him. She turned back to her books and continued organizing them, hoping he would go away. After what felt like forever, she finally heard him walk away, but the uneasy feeling remained. At the dinner that night, Sarah felt Mark's eyes on her again. Every time she looked up, he was staring at her from across the table. She tried to eat quickly, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Auntie Lydia, she asked, trying to sound casual, "How long is Mark going to stay here?" Auntie Lydia looked surprised by the question. "Oh, Mark," she said, glancing at him with a smile. "He'll be staying with us for quite some time. His mother is a very close friend of mine, and he's like family to us. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Sarah replied quickly, forcing a smile. "I was just wondering." But the more times she spent in the house, the more uncomfortable she felt. Every time she walked down the hall or sat in the living room, she felt like Mark was always close by, watching her. She started to avoid the common areas, spending most of her time in her room with the door closed. She told herself she was being silly, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. One afternoon, as Sarah was sitting on her bed reading a book, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she called, expecting it to be Auntie Lydia. But when the door opened, it was Mark. He stood there in the doorway, looking at her with that same intense expression. Sarah's heart raced. She didn't like the way he was staring at her, and she felt trapped. She quickly looked away, pretending to be busy with her book. After a few seconds, Mark finally left, but the encounter left her feeling shaken. Sarah soon realized that Auntie Lydia and her friend Ruth, who was also Mark's mother, spent a lot of time together. They would often go out shopping or meet up for lunch, leaving Sarah and Mark alone in the house. Sarah dreaded these times. She didn't want to be alone with him, but she didn't know how to avoid it. Auntie Lydia didn't seem to notice anything strange, and Sarah didn't want to cause trouble by saying something. "Sarah, we're going out for a while," Auntie Lydia called one afternoon. Ruth stood by the door, smiling warmly at Sarah. "We won't be long. If you need anything, Mark is here." Sarah forced a smile, even though her stomach was in knots. "Okay, Auntie Lydia, have a nice time." But inside, she was filled with dread. The thought of being alone with Mark again made her feel uneasy. As soon as they left, the house became very quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock in the living room. Sarah felt the silence pressing down on her, making the house seem larger and emptier than it really was. She decided to take a shower to relax and clear her mind. Maybe some warm water would help her feel better. Sarah gathered her clothes and a towel, heading to the bathroom. She locked the door behind her and turned on the water. The warmth of the water felt good, and for the first time that day, she started to relax. She let the water run over her, washing away the tension she had been feeling. But just as she was rinsing the soap from her hair, she heard a voice outside the bathroom door. It was Mark. "Come out. I'm waiting for you," he said. His voice was low, but there was something about the way he said it that made Sarah's heart stop. Her hand froze in her hair, her body stiff with fear. She didn't know what to do. Mark's voice sounded serious and dreadful, like he wasn't just playing around. Sarah felt her stomach twist with fear as she stood there, frozen in the warm water. She didn't know what to do or say or how to respond to him. All she knew was that she didn't want to open the door. Sarah was terrified as she stood frozen inside the bathroom, her heart pounding against her chest. She could not believe the words that had just come out of Mark's mouth. Fear gripped her, and her mind was racing. Her legs trembled, and her hands were shaking as she pressed her back against the bathroom wall. The words Mark said to her echoed in her ears, and she could feel the cold sweat running down her forehead. She felt a sense of disbelief wash over her. Did he mean what he just said, or? Sarah's heart raced even faster as she tried to understand. What was Mark talking about? The more she thought about it, the more her fear grew. She knew she had to do something, but what? How was she going to get out of this? Her voice trembled as she called out, "What do you mean by that, Mark?" Sarah hoped that she had misunderstood him, that maybe she had gotten it all wrong. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But deep down, she knew there was something terribly wrong. Mark laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. His voice was cold, and the laugh sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Come on, Sarah," he said, as though he was talking to someone who was pretending not to know something. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." The way he spoke made Sarah's stomach turn. Her heart sank. She wanted to run, but she had nowhere to go. The bathroom was small, and she was trapped. Sarah's hand shook as she tried to find her words. "Done what before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to sound strong, but there was no hiding the fear in her voice. "What are you talking about?" Mark's tone became even more frightening. His voice was no longer playful but serious and threatening. "Don't act like you don't know," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You know exactly what I am talking about." Panic surged through Sarah's body. She pressed herself harder against the wall, trying to think of a way out, but her mind was blank. What was Mark talking about? She had never done anything like this before. Why was he acting this way? She knew she had to stay in control, but it was hard when every part of her was shaking. "I'm not coming out, Mark," Sarah called back, trying to sound braver than she felt. She knew she couldn't let him see how scared she was. Mark's footsteps grew louder as he walked towards the bathroom door. The sound of his shoes tapping against the floor made Sarah's heart beat even faster. "Do you think you can hide in there forever?" Mark sneered. His voice was filled with confidence, as though he knew that Sarah had no way out. "I can hear you, Sarah. I know you are scared." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard him place his ear against the door. She could feel his presence on the other side. She had to act fast. She couldn't let him get to her. Without thinking, she pushed the door with all the strength she could muster. The door flew open and it hit Mark right in the head. Mark let out a yelp of pain, and Sarah heard him stumble back. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Without wasting a second, Sarah bolted out of the bedroom and ran towards her bedroom. Her heart was pounding and she felt like her legs could give out any moment, but she forced herself to keep going. Once she reached her bedroom, Sarah slammed the door shut behind her and quickly turned the key to lock it. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped the key, but she managed to lock the door just in time. She backed away from the door, breathing heavily. Her heart was racing and her hands were trembling. But the banging on the door started almost immediately. Mark was furious. His fist pounded against the wood, and his voice was filled with anger. "You think you're safe in there?" he shouted. "You can't hide from me, Sarah. Your aunt and my mom are going to be out for a long time. It's just you and me now." Sarah felt a wave of terror wash over her. She backed up until she hit the edge of her bed. She sat down, her mind spinning. What was she going to do? She couldn't stay in her room forever. But if she opened the door, she didn't know what Mark would do. She was scared and she didn't have anyone to help her. The pounding on the door grew louder. Mark was trying to force his way in, and Sarah could hear the door shaking as he pushed against it. "Let me in, Sarah," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You are only making this harder for yourself." Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the bed, and she felt her whole body trembling. She didn't know what to do. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like it would burst out of her chest. Suddenly, the banging stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Sarah listened, her breath catching in her throat. What happened? Why had Mark stopped? She held her breath, hoping that maybe he had given up and gone away. But then, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The front door of the house had opened, and Sarah heard heavy footsteps coming from the hallway. For a brief moment, hope fled in her chest. Had Auntie Lydia and Mrs. Allen come back early, maybe they would be able to help her. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. But then, she heard the voices, and her heart sank. The voices weren't familiar. They were deep and unfamiliar, and they sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah's hope turned to dread as she realized that whoever had just entered the house was not there to help her. She pressed her ear against the door and listened. "Where is she?" one of the voices asked. The voice was rough, and it sent chills through Sarah's body. "She's in the room," Mark answered, his voice smug and confident. Sarah's heart immediately sank when she heard his words. What was going on? Who were these people? Why were they looking for her? "I thought you said you would have her ready by the time we came for her," the unfamiliar voice said. "I know I said that," Mark replied, his voice sounding a little nervous, but something went wrong. "Step aside," the unfamiliar voice said, sounding impatient. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it might burst. She could hear the heavy footsteps getting closer and closer to her door. Her mind was racing as she tried to think of a way out, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. Her hands were shaking and her breathing was shallow. She knew she had to act fast, but she didn't know what to do. She had no way of escaping, and the men were getting closer. Sarah felt a wave of fear wash over her as she realized that there was nothing she could do. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Sarah was frozen when in her room, her ear pressed against the door as she listened intently. The house was eerily quiet now. The voices of the strange men and the Mark's footsteps had vanished, leaving only silence behind. For a moment, Sarah wondered if everything that had happened was just a terrible dream, but the fear gripping her made it feel all too real. She waited in the stillness, hardly daring to breathe. Her heart pounded so loudly that she could almost hear it echoing in her ears. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the silence seemed endless. Slowly, her breathing became less raged. Maybe they really had left, but why had they gone? Just as Sarah began to let her guard down, she heard a gentle knock on the door. Her breath caught in her throat, and she listened carefully. It was Mark's voice, but it was soft and sounded different from before. "Sarah, I'm really sorry about what happened earlier. I didn't mean to scare you. Please just let me explain." Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't trust Mark after what had happened. His earlier tone had been menacing, and she couldn't forget how frightened she had been. Yet, his voice now sounded sincere, almost remorseful. I don't know if I can trust you, Mark," she said, her voice trembling. Mark's voice was gentle, almost pleading. "Please, Sarah, I'm really sorry. I was out of line and I feel terrible about it. I bought you some juice to make up for it. Can we just talk? I promise no more games." Sarah bit her lip, struggling with her fear and uncertainty. She didn't want to remain locked in her room, alone and scared. Slowly, she reached for the doorknob and turned it, opening the door just a crack. Mark stood there, holding a tray with a glass of juice. His face showed genuine regret, and his voice was soft. "I'm really sorry," he repeated, his tone gentle. "I just want to make things right between us." Sarah eyed him, but stepped back to let him in. "Okay," she said quietly, "but just for a while." Mark walked in and set the tray down on the table. He handed her the glass of juice. Sarah took it hesitantly, feeling uneasy. Mark gestured to the living room. "I thought we could watch something together," he said, trying to sound casual and friendly. Sarah nodded and took a sip of the juice. It was cold and sweet, and she felt a bit more relaxed as she settled onto the couch. Mark turned on the TV and began scrolling through the channels until he found a movie. They sat together on the couch, watching the screen. As the movie played, Sarah started to feel strange. Her eyelid felt heavy and her body seemed to become very tired. The couch felt soft and comforting, and she found herself sinking into it. "Mark, what is in this juice?" she asked, her voice thick with sleepiness. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her with an unsettling smile. "Just relax, Sarah. Everything is going to be fine." Panic fled in Sarah's chest, but she was too drowsy to fight it. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to keep her eyes open. But the sleepiness was too strong. Her body felt like lead, and she couldn't fight the wave of exhaustion. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Mark leaning closer, his smile widening. Then everything around her faded away, and Sarah fell into a deep unconscious sleep. Sarah woke up the next morning feeling disoriented and confused. She was lying in bed, and her head throbbed with a dull pounding pain like someone was hitting her with a hammer. The sunlight streaming through the curtains made her squint, and she groaned softly as she tried to remember what had happened the night before. But her memory was hazy, and the details slipped away like sand through her fingers. As she slowly sat up, Sarah noticed with alarm that she wasn't wearing the clothes she had on the previous night. Instead, she was dressed in an old t-shirt and a pair of shorts that she didn't recall putting on. Panic gripped her as she tried to piece together the events of the previous night. But everything was a blur. The last clear memory she had was drinking the juice Mark had given her, and then nothing. Her heart raced as she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She needed to find her aunt and get some answers. As she made her way to the living room, her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. When Sarah reached the parlor, she saw her auntie sitting on the couch looking at her mobile phone. Relief surged through her at the sight of her aunt, but it was quickly followed by a gnawing sense of dread. "Auntie Lydia," Sarah began, her voice shaky as she walked into the room. "What happened last night? I don't remember much." Her auntie looked up from the phone, her expression warm and concerned. "Oh, Sarah, you were sound asleep when I came back last night. I didn't want to wake you. You were out like a light." Sarah's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of this. You came back last night?" "Yes, I did," Auntie Lydia confirmed, setting her phone aside and giving her a reassuring smile. "I tried to wake you, but you didn't respond. It was as if you were deeply asleep from something." Sarah blinked, struggling to fight the pieces of puzzle together. "I don't remember that at all. The last thing I remember is watching a movie with Mark, and then nothing." Her auntie's expression softened, and she patted Sarah's hand. "You've been under a lot of stress, dear. It's no wonder you are feeling a bit out of sorts, but everything is fine now. You are safe." "Mark," Sarah said slowly, her mind still swelling with questions. "Where is he? I didn't see him this morning." Auntie Lydia sighed and shook her head slightly. "Oh, Mark and his mother left early this morning. They had to go back home. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He left just like that? Yes, Auntie Lydia said casually. Mark said he didn't want to wake you. They said their goodbyes and left quietly. Sarah stared at her aunt, trying to understand what was happening. Something felt off, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. Did Mark say anything before he left? Not really, Auntie Lydia replied, her voice a bit puzzled. Why? Is something wrong, Sarah? Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain the uneasy feeling that was growing inside her. I just don't worry about it, Auntie. It's nothing. Auntie Lydia sighed again, clearly losing patience. Sarah, why are you asking so many questions? I told you they left. What is the big deal? Sarah apologized softly, but the uneasy in her chest remained. She forced a smile and nodded, but as she headed back to her room, her mind was far from at ease. She felt as if something important had happened the night before, something she couldn't remember clearly, and she knew it had something to do with Mark. Ever since Mark and his mother left, Sarah seemed to change. The once cheerful girl who brought joy and laughter to the house had become quiet and withdrawn. She spent most of her time locked away in her room, only coming out occasionally, and even then, her face showed sadness. Auntie Lydia noticed this change right away. At first, she thought it was just the stress from recent events, but as days turned into weeks, she realized that Sarah wasn't just tired. She was hiding something, and Auntie Lydia didn't understand why. One afternoon, Auntie Lydia knocked gently on Sarah's door. Sarah, are you okay? You've been in there for hours. There was a long silence before Sarah's voice came from inside, muffled and faint. I'm fine, Auntie. Just tired. Auntie Lydia frowned, feeling more worried. Are you sure? You've been saying that a lot. Are you getting sick? No, Auntie Lydia, Sarah replied quickly. I'm okay. I just need some rest. Auntie Lydia wasn't convinced. Sarah had never been this distant before, and it troubled her deeply. She wanted to give Sarah space, but she also felt uneasy. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. That evening, during dinner, Auntie Lydia decided to address the issue directly. As they sat at the table, the silence between them was heavy. Sarah poked at her food, not eating much, her mind clearly elsewhere. Sarah, Auntie Lydia began gently. I've noticed you've been acting different. You are not yourself. Is something wrong? Sarah looked up, surprised by the question. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, Auntie Lydia. Really, I am. Auntie Lydia pressed on. You don't seem fine. You've been alone a lot and not eating well. If something is bothering you, you can talk to me. Sarah nodded, but she didn't speak. She just stared at her plate, moving her food around with her fork. I'm serious, Sarah, Auntie Lydia said, her voice firmer now. I'm worried. What's going on? Sarah was about to reply when she suddenly felt a wave of nausea. Her stomach churned violently. She jumped up from the table, rushing to the bathroom. Auntie Lydia quickly followed her. Sarah, what is wrong? She called out, her voice filled with concern. Sarah barely made it to the toilet before she started to throw up, her body shaking with each heave. Auntie Lydia stood behind her, rubbing her back gently, her worry deepening. Oh, Sarah, Auntie Lydia said softly, this isn't just tiredness. You've been unwell for a while now. How long has this been happening? Sarah shook her head weakly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. I'm fine, Auntie Lydia, she said, though her voice was trembling. It's nothing really. Auntie Lydia wasn't convinced. Sarah, this isn't nothing. You've been acting strangely, and now you are sick. Have you seen a doctor? No, I don't need a doctor, Sarah replied, standing up unsteadily. I'm just stressed, Auntie. But Auntie Lydia's instincts told her there was more to it. Sarah, I hope it's not what I'm thinking. Sarah's eyes widened in panic, her heart racing. No, Auntie Lydia, it's not that. She protested, though she could feel the nausea returning. I'm fine, I promise. Auntie Lydia crossed her arms, looking at Sarah with a mix of concern and suspicion. Sarah, Are you sure? Because if it's what I'm thinking. Sarah's stomach churned again and she couldn't hold back any longer. She rushed back to the toilet, throwing up once more. Auntie Lydia watched, her expression growing serious and worried. The following days were a blur for Sarah. She tried hard to act normal, but the constant usual and frequent trips to the bathroom made it almost impossible. Every time she felt her stomach twist, she rushed to the bathroom, hoping her aunt wouldn't notice. But Auntie Lydia wasn't easily deceived. Sarah would lock herself in the bathroom, leaning over the toilet as she emptied her stomach. Afterward, she would wipe her mouth, take a deep breath, and tell herself it was just a temporary issue that would soon pass. Deep down, however, she felt something was terribly wrong. Auntie Lydia noticed that Sarah's behavior had changed even more. It wasn't just the isolation. There was a constant discomfort on Sarah's face, and she was clearly avoiding her. When Auntie Lydia tried to talk to her, Sarah gave short replies and excused herself, often to her room or to the bathroom. One afternoon, Auntie Lydia heard the unmistakable sound of Sarah retching from the bathroom. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. "Sarah, are you okay in there?" she called out, her voice filled with concern. There was a long pause before Sarah's shaky voice answered, "I'm fine, Auntie Lydia. Just something I ate, I think." Auntie Lydia's worry deepened. This wasn't the first time Sarah had said that, and she suspected it wasn't the truth, but she decided not to push it just yet. "All right there, let me know if you need anything." Days went by, and Sarah continued to withdraw from everyone. She spent long hours alone in her room, only coming out when absolutely necessary. Auntie Lydia could hear her niece pacing back and forth at night, her footsteps a constant reminder that something was very wrong. One night, Sarah woke up with a sharp, painful urge to vomit. The feeling hit her like a wave, and she barely had time to get out of bed and rush to the bathroom. The house was quiet, and she hoped she could make it to the toilet without waking Auntie Lydia. She reached the bathroom just in time, falling to her knees as she vomited into the toilet. The sound echoed in the small room, and Sarah's body shook with each heave. When it finally stopped, she sat back, breathing heavily, her mind racing. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered to herself, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her heart pounded with fear as the terrifying thoughts crossed her mind. Could it really be possible? Sarah sat there, lost in her thoughts. She suddenly noticed a presence behind her. She turned slowly and saw Auntie Lydia standing in the bathroom doorway, her face a mix of concern and determination. "Auntie Lydia," Sarah's voice was barely audible, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. Auntie Lydia stepped into the bathroom, her expression serious. Sarah tried to protest, to insist that she was fine, but no words came out. A tear slipped down her cheek as the weight of her situation finally hit her. "Auntie Lydia, Be quiet," Auntie Lydia said firmly. "Go and get some sleep. We are going to the hospital first thing tomorrow, and you better hope it's not what I'm thinking, or there will be serious consequences." Auntie Lydia left the bathroom, leaving Sarah alone with her fears. Sarah sat on the bathroom floor, feeling a deep sense of dread. The thought of a hospital visit was frightening, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed to find out what was happening to her. The next morning came early for Sarah and Auntie Lydia. The air felt heavy with unspoken worries as they prepared to leave for the hospital. Sarah had a tight knot of anxiety in her stomach, a mix of fear and dread that she couldn't shake. Auntie Lydia, on the other hand, had a serious look on her face as she drove them through the still quiet streets. The car ride was silent. The only noises were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustles as Sarah shifted nervously in her seat. She glanced at her aunt several times, hoping for some comfort, but Auntie Lydia kept her eyes on the road, lost in her thoughts. When they arrived at the hospital, they were taken to the waiting room. They sat in silence, Sarah fidgeting with her hands, her mind racing with worry about what the doctor might say. Auntie Lydia sat beside her, her arms crossed tightly, showing how tense she was. Eventually, a nurse called them into the examination room. There, they met Dr. Nnamdi, a middle-aged man with kind eyes. Despite his gentle manner, Sarah couldn't shake the anxiety that gripped her. Good morning, Dr. Nnamdi greeted them with a warm smile. I understand you've been feeling unwell, Sarah. We will do some tests to find out what's causing your symptoms. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding with a heavy beat. Auntie Lydia stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the doctor as he explained what would happen next. Sarah felt as if she were in a daze, the reality of the situation sinking in slowly. The tests were quick, but waiting for the results seemed like an eternity. Sarah sat on the examination table, her legs swinging nervously. Auntie Lydia stood by the door, her arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, Dr. Nnamdi returned with a folder containing the test results. He sat down across from Sarah and her aunt, his face serious but gentle. I have the results, he said, his tone steady. Sarah, the test shows that you are pregnant. The words hit Sarah like a heavy blow. She felt her face go pale, her vision blurring as the room seemed to close in around her. Pregnant? How could this happen? Her mind raced, trying to understand what she had just heard. Auntie Lydia's reaction was immediate. As soon as Dr. Nnamdi spoke, she turned to Sarah with anger in her eyes. What did you say? She demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Before Sarah could respond, Auntie Lydia's hand came down sharply on her cheek, the sting of her slap bringing Sarah back to reality. You are pregnant? Auntie Lydia repeated, her voice rising with anger. How could you do this? Sarah recoiled, tears springing to her eyes as she touched her stinging cheek. Auntie Lydia, don't try to explain, Auntie Lydia shouted, cutting her off. I trusted you. I brought you into my home, and this is how you repay me? Dr. Nnamdi cleared his throat, trying to calm the situation. Please, let's stay calm. This is a difficult time, but we need to handle it carefully. But Auntie Lydia was beyond reason. Her face was flushed with anger as she turned to Sarah, her voice full of rage. You've shamed me. Sarah, do you have any idea what you've done? Sarah could only shake her head, tears flowing freely as she struggled to understand what was happening. She was overwhelmed and too stunned to speak. Auntie Lydia continued, her voice trembling with fury. Who is the father? She demanded. Who did this to you? Sarah's mind was a blank. She had no answers, no explanations to offer. The events of the past week felt like a blow, and the thought of being pregnant hadn't even crossed her mind until now. I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Auntie Lydia's eyes widened in disbelief. You don't know? She repeated, her voice rising. What do you mean you don't know? Who is responsible for this? Sarah tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. Fear and shame left her paralyzed, unable to provide the answers her aunt demanded. Unbelievable, Auntie Lydia muttered, shaking her head. This is what happens when you lack discipline and respect for yourself. Dr. Nnamdi attempted to intervene again. Ma'am, we need to focus on Sarah's health. This is a delicate situation, and she needs our support. Auntie Lydia shot him a look of cold fury. Support? What she needs is to face the consequences of her actions. She turned back to Sarah, her voice cold and final. Get up, we are leaving. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Too stunned to fully grasp what was happening, she slid off the examination table, her legs unsteady as she followed her aunt out of the room. The drive home was even quieter and more tense than before. Sarah stared out the window, her thoughts of a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of her changed reality. When they arrived home, Auntie Lydia wasted no time. She slammed the car door shut and marched inside, Sarah following behind. As soon as they were inside, Auntie Lydia turned on to Sarah again. "How could you be so careless, Sarah?" she yelled, her voice echoing through the house. "Do you have any idea what this means? You've ruined your life and brought shame to this family." Sarah flinched at the harsh words, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Auntie Lydia," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sorry?" Auntie Lydia spat, her voice blazing. "Sorry isn't enough. You are going back to your mother's house. I won't have this disgrace under my roof." Sarah's heart sank at the thought of returning to her mother's house, a place she had been desperate to escape. She looked at her aunt, hoping for some mercy, but Auntie Lydia's expression was as hard as stone. "Go," Auntie Lydia ordered coldly. "Pack your things. You are leaving today." Sarah hesitated, hoping her aunt might change her mind, but the look in Auntie Lydia's eyes made it clear there would be no second chances. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked to her room, the tears finally falling as she began to pack her belongings. As she stuffed her clothes into her bag, Sarah's mind was a storm of emotions: fear, shame, confusion, and a deep sorrow. How had her life changed so drastically? Just a few months ago, she had been filled with hope for the future. Now everything was falling apart. Auntie Lydia's voice interrupted her thought. "Hurry up, Sarah, we don't have all day." Sarah wiped her eyes and packed faster. With one last look around her house, she picked up her bag and walked back to the living room, where Auntie Lydia waited, arms crossed. "Let's go," Auntie Lydia said coldly, heading for the door. Sarah followed her silently, her heart heavy as she stepped out of the house. She was going back to the life she had tried hard to leave behind. As they drove away, Sarah gazed out the window, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what the future held, but she was sure of one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. The drive to Sarah's house felt very quiet. Sarah sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. She was nervous about what was going to happen next. Auntie Lydia drove with a serious look on her face, not saying anything. When they reached Sarah's old house, her mother was outside, walking in the garden. She looked surprised to see them. She hadn't expected visitors, especially not at this early hour. She quickly wiped her hands and came over to greet them. "Sarah, Lydia, what a surprise," her mother said with a warm smile. She noticed the serious expression on their face and felt a bit worried. "Come inside." Auntie Lydia walked into the house with a serious look, and Sarah followed her, feeling sad and heavy-hearted. They sat in the small living room. Sarah's mother looked at her sister and daughter with concern. "What is the matter? Is everything okay?" Auntie Lydia took a deep breath and said firmly, "There is no easy way to say this. Sarah is pregnant." The room was filled with silence as Sarah's mother stared in shock. She looked at Sarah, who kept her eyes on the floor, too ashamed to meet her mother's gaze. "But how?" her mother asked, still not believing what she had just heard. "Who is the father?" Auntie Lydia sighed with frustration. "That's the problem. She doesn't even know who the father is. I brought her into my house, and this is how she repays me." Sarah's mother looked at her daughter with a broken heart. "Sarah, how did this happen? What have you done?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Mama. I don't remember everything. I didn't mean for this to happen." Tears filled her mother's eyes. "Oh, Sarah, what are we going to do now?" Auntie Lydia stood up, her expression stern. "She can't stay with me anymore. I have my own family to think about. I'm sorry, but she had to stay with you." Sarah's mother felt desperate. "But Lydia, how will we manage? You know things are tough for us." Auntie Lydia's face softened a little, but she remained firm. "I will send some money when I can, but I can't promise it will be regular. I've done what I can, but my responsibility ends here." With that, Auntie Lydia picked up her purse and headed for the door. Sarah and her mother followed her outside, still in shock. "Lydia, please, don't leave us like this," her mother pleaded. But Auntie Lydia was already at her car. "I've said all I can. You two need to figure this out now." Sarah watched as her auntie drove away, feeling like her world was falling apart. How had things gone so wrong? Her mother put a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Come inside, Sarah, we need to talk." They went back inside the house, the atmosphere heavy with sadness. Sarah's mother sat her down at the kitchen table, her face full of worry. "Sarah, we need to figure out what to do next." Sarah's voice was soft. "I'm really sorry, Mama. I didn't mean for this to happen." Her mother shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I know, my child, but we have to deal with it now." Sarah wiped her tears and thought about all the challenges ahead. "What will we do? I can't stay in school now, and I don't know how we will manage with a baby coming." Her mother's voice cracked with sadness. "We will find a way. We've managed before, but it will be hard. You know we are struggling as if it is." Sarah felt even more worried. Life had always been difficult for them, and now with a baby on the way, it seemed almost impossible. The future looked very uncertain and difficult. As the days passed, Sarah's situation became clearer. Her aunt never sent the money she had promised. Sarah's mother did her best to provide for them, but things were getting worse. The stress was taking a toll on her mother's health. Sarah had to leave school, her dreams of a better future fading away. Instead of studying, she spent her days helping her mother and preparing for the baby. She was no longer the hopeful girl she once was. Her spirit was crushed by the weight of her situation. Every day was a struggle, and every night was filled with fear. Sarah often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had ended up in this place. The thought of the baby growing inside her was overwhelming. She still didn't know who the father was, and the idea of raising a child on her own seemed like a huge challenge. Sarah and her mother tried to keep going, even though things were very difficult. They faced each day with hope, knowing that they had to keep moving forward despite the hardships. The future was unclear, and Sarah felt like she was starting over from scratch. She hoped for a better tomorrow, but knew it would take a lot of strength and determination to overcome the obstacles ahead. As Sarah looked at her mother, she saw the love and worry in her eyes. They would face this new chapter together, no matter how tough it would be. And so, Sarah prepared herself for the challenges ahead, determined to do her best for herself and her future child. The road was long and uncertain, but with her mother's support, Sarah knew she had a chance to find hope and a new beginning. Mark has been restless for months, thinking about everything he had done to Sarah. He could no longer bear the guilt of what had happened. After much hesitation, he decided to visit Auntie Lydia to learn about Sarah's whereabouts. He hadn't seen Sarah for a long time, and he felt it was time to face the truth. When Mark arrived at Auntie Lydia's house, she was surprised to see him. She had not expected him to show up after all the time that had passed. Mark nervously explained why he was there. He confessed everything to Auntie Lydia, admitting that he was the one who had drugged Sarah that night and was responsible for her pregnancy. Auntie Lydia's face darkened with anger as she listened to his confession. "How could you do such a thing, Mark?" Auntie Lydia asked, her voice shaking with fury. "Do you know how much Sarah had suffered because of what you did?" Mark lowered his head, feeling the weight of her words. "I know, Auntie. I'm really sorry for everything. I regret it deeply. That is why I'm here, to make things right. I want to make things right. I want to take my responsibility." Auntie Lydia stared at him, her eyes filled with disappointment. "You should have thought about that before you did such a terrible thing. Now you want me to go with you to Sarah and plead on your behalf. No, Mark, you will have to sort things out on your own. Sarah deserves better." Mark understood that Auntie Lydia was too angry to help him. She had every right to be. He realized that if he was going to make things right with Sarah, he would have to do that alone. He thanked Auntie Lydia for time and left the house, determined to find Sarah and apologize to her in person. With a heavy heart, Mark made his way to the village where Sarah was now living. He couldn't help but feel nervous as he approached her home. He knew that what he was about to do would be difficult, but he had to face Sarah and admit his wrongs. When he arrived, Sarah was outside playing with her son. She didn't expect to see Mark standing there. Her heart skipped a beat as memories of the past flooded her mind. Mark walked up to her slowly, his face full of remorse. "Sarah," Mark began, his voice soft but firm. "I've come to ask for your forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. I want to take responsibility for everything. I want to be there for you and our son." Sarah looked at Mark, unsure of how to feel. She had gone through so much without him for these past years. Life had been hard, but she had managed to survive with the help of her mother. Could she really forgive him after everything? Mark continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am willing to do anything to make things right. I want to be a part of your life and our son's life. Please, give me a chance." Sarah was silent for a moment, thinking about what Mark had said. She had every reason to be angry with him, but something in his voice told her that he was truly sorry. Deep down, she knew that forgiveness was not just about him. It was also about her healing and moving forward. After a long pause, Sarah finally spoke. "Mark, you hurt me deeply. It hadn't been easy for me or my mother, but I believe people can change. If you're serious about making things right, then I'm willing to give you a chance." Mark's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. I promise you won't regret this." Soon after, Mark and Sarah began to rebuild their relationship. Mark proved that he was serious about taking care of Sarah and their child. They got married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by their loved ones. It was a day filled with joy and hope for the future. As time passed, Sarah decided to return to school to complete her studies. She had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, and now, with Mark's support, that dream became a reality. She worked hard and graduated at top of her class, earning the title of Dr. Sarah. Her heart was full of pride as she achieved what she had always wanted. Life became much better for Sarah and her family, with Mark by her side and her successful career as a doctor. The days of hardship were over. Sarah's mother, Mrs. John, no longer had to struggle to make ends meet. Sarah made sure her mother was well taken care of and never lacked anything. But Sarah knew there was still one more thing she needed to do. She had to mend her relationship with Auntie Lydia. After everything that had happened, Auntie Lydia had been a big part of Sarah's life, and Sarah wanted to make things right. One day, Sarah visited Auntie Lydia. When Auntie Lydia opened the door and saw Sarah standing there, she was surprised but happy to see her. Sarah hugged her and said, "Auntie, I came to apologize for everything that happened. I want to thank you for all the support you gave me during those difficult times." Auntie Lydia smiled warmly. "There is no need to apologize, my dear. I'm just glad to see you happy and doing well." Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The wounds of the past were finally healing, and she had found happiness again. She had a loving family, a successful career, and a bright future ahead. Mark and Sarah lived happily ever after, raising their daughter together with love and care. Sarah's dreams had come true, and life had become fair again for Mrs. John, who no longer had to worry about the future. The days of struggles were behind them, and the family looked forward to a life filled with joy and new possibilities. And so, the story of Sarah, Mark, and their family came to a close, showing that even after hardship and pain, there is always a chance for forgiveness, healings, and new beginnings. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures, where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.